A century and a half ago, America was considered so large, her mountains were so high, her rivers so wild, and her forests so dense that no one had ever crossed from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. A few courageous men decided that they would build a railroad across the great American wilderness. I was one of them. My name is Patrick Murphy. Although I was only 12 years old, I helped build America's first transcontinental railroad. For many of us, building the railroad was like waging a war. It was a war against nature, against time, and between two great armies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads. We all battled for one thing: to drive a simple golden spike and connect America with twin rails of steel. This is a story about how we built America's first transcontinental railroad. Our story begins on the banks of the Missouri River. 200 years ago, most Americans lived in the states east of the Missouri River. The land west of the Missouri was a vast wilderness. Between 1800 and 1860, more than 5 million people came from Europe to live in America. The eastern cities were becoming overcrowded, and America needed room to grow. The only way to grow was west, and so many people headed west to settle Oregon and California. But their journey was a long and dangerous one. If they joined a wagon train, it took them 6 months to reach the west coast. Many people died along the way. Steam trains were a lot faster and safer than wagon trains. But in the 1860s, there were no railroads west of the Missouri River. That would change on July 1st, 1862, when President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act. He offered free land to anyone willing to build a railroad that would link the East with California. No sooner was President Lincoln's signature dry than a businessman named Thomas C. Durant set out to get the money to build the Union Pacific Railroad. Meanwhile, in California, the Central Pacific Railroad was authorized to build track from the Pacific Ocean to connect with the Union Pacific. When finished, the two railroads would join tracks to form a continuous line from the Missouri River to California. 4 California merchants named Collis B. Huntington, Leland Stanford, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins incorporated the Central Pacific Railroad, and picked a civil engineer named Theodore D. Judah to map a route east through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Thomas C. Durant chose a former Civil War general, Grenville M. Dodge, to lay out the Union Pacific route west from Nebraska. In the summer of 1865, when I was just 12 years old, I joined General Dodge's army of track layers. It was my job to carry the water to the thirsty workmen. Most of us were Irish immigrants, but there were some Civil War veterans, Mexicans, and even some convicts who worked building the railroad. We began in Omaha, Nebraska, heading west, laying tracks across the Great Plains. At first, the going was easy. But for the Central Pacific Railroad in California, we heard that it was a different story. Almost immediately, they had to find a way to lay tracks across the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains. It was a grueling task, and many of their workers quit before the construction foreman, J.H. Strobridge, decided to hire Chinese workers. They proved to be industrious, and before the end of 1865, 7,000 Orientals were boring, clearing, and laying track for the Central Pacific. Meanwhile, back on the Union Pacific, General Dodge hired 2 brothers to ramrod our track gang. The first time I laid eyes on them, I knew Jack and Dan Casement were a team to be reckoned with. Dan Casement handled the paperwork, making sure we had supplies and we got paid. General John S. Casement was our field boss. He was a flashy character who loved having his picture taken in a Cossack cap and fur-trimmed coat. He carried a bullwhip everywhere he went and wouldn't hesitate to use it. By the spring of 1866, we were laying better than a mile of track a day as we attacked the level Platte Valley with 100 teams of horses and 1,000 men. But our supply problems were staggering. It took hundreds of thousands of pounds of wood, gravel, and steel to build the railroad. Lumber was cut from faraway forests and made into ties. We used 10 million ties. Then we needed more lumber for bridges. And in the mountains in winter, we used lumber to build snow sheds. We also needed steel for the rails. We used 800,000 rails and attached them to the wooden ties with 8 million spikes. And all of it had to be brought hundreds of miles from faraway factories. We also needed food, and so did our animals, but we were miles from the nearest town. The locomotives needed water, and there wasn't much of it where we were laying track. To make matters worse, the summer of 1866 was very hot. The heat slowed us down. Then, when winter came, driving blizzards forced us to stop working altogether. Meanwhile, the Central Pacific was still storming in the western mountains. Mr. Strobridge's army of Chinese workers was now more than 10,000 strong, and they began tunneling through sheer granite cliffs towards the top of the Sierras. We had it easy by comparison. It took them 2 years to build a tunnel through the top of Donner Pass. They were long hours in dark, bitter cold granite caves. With black powder and nitroglycerin, hammer and chisel, they moved forward at only 8 inches a day, and some of them paid with their lives. But when completed, their summit tunnel was the longest on any railroad, 1,659 feet through solid granite. However, to this point, they had laid only 39 miles of track at a cost of $8 million. But those first 39 miles of the Central Pacific is considered even today to be the most difficult built by any railroad. It was much easier for us. By the spring of 1867, as soon as the snows melted, our Union Pacific crews continued laying track. By April of 1868, we reached Laramie, Wyoming. But from there, we entered country that became more and more desolate and inhospitable. For the Central Pacific, 1868 was a remarkable year. They had crossed the treacherous Sierras, and their crews were putting down 350 miles of track at the rate of more than a mile a day.
There's 20 terriers a-working at the rock, and the boss comes along and he says, "Keep still, and come down heavy with the cast iron drill, and drill ye terriers drill, and drill ye terriers drill. It's a work all day for the sugar in your tay, down along the railway, and drill ye terriers drill, and drill ye terriers drill, and blast, and blast, and fire."
By now, we were both building a track towards each other so fast, we had to agree on a place where our lines would meet. On April 6, 1869, word came from Washington, D.C. Our tracks would connect at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory on May the 10th. The day we had all been waiting for dawned overcast and cool. Promontory Summit was a desolate place. A cold wind swept across the plain where we would soon connect the two halves of America with steel rails. We stopped building our rails just short of the Central Pacific tracks. By late morning, before the celebration began, a telegraph was set up at trackside. Working on a table nearby, W.N. Schilling attached a wire to the sledgehammer, then put another wire on a spike, so that when the final spike was hammered, it could be heard, as it happened, on America's first nationwide telegraph hookup. At exactly 12:47 p.m. on May the 10th, 1869, I watched as General Granville Dodge took the sledgehammer and drove the last golden spike into the wooden tie. In Chicago, San Francisco, and Washington, they heard 3 taps as Dodge drove the last spike home. Then W.N. Schilling tapped out the word done. You could hardly hear anyone speak. The Central Pacific and the Union Pacific locomotives blew their whistles and moved forward. As their cowcatchers touched, somebody uncorked a champagne bottle, a military band played, and we all posed for a photograph that has become one of the most famous pictures of all time. Within a day after we drove the last spike, I saw the first through transcontinental train steam past Promontory. A short time later, I watched as a freight from California roared past, carrying Japanese teas to the East Coast. Just 4 days after that, regular cross-country train service was started. The trip from the Missouri River to California took only 5 days and cost $150. Once the railroad was built, settlers by the hundreds of thousands came into the West. Because of the railroad I had helped build, California would be settled, and new states would soon be carved out of the wilderness. For many decades, the railroads would dominate America, and in the span of my lifetime, they would help make America a world power. I am proud to say that I was part of history when I helped build America's first transcontinental railroad.